Hello, everyone. My name is Ponce Garcia, and my presentation is going to be about why strengthening ties between cops and people will benefit our country. So, my thesis is building strong relationships between cops and people will heavily benefit our country. So, the first thing I want to mention is what we can't ignore in the police department, and that's corruption in the police department. In recent times, the relationship between cops and people has been heavily severed, and it's getting worse and worse. And the tension is building, the racial tension is building, the hate is building. There's a lot of evidence that I can show you to prove that the police department is corrupt, and there's a lot of reforming and work that needs to be done. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, 52% of police officers report that it is not unusual for law enforcement officials to turn a blind eye to the improper conduct of other officers. The same source, 61% of police officers state that they do not always report serious abuse that has been directly observed by fellow officers. The same source, 43% of police officers agree with this sentiment. Always following the rules is not compatible with the need to get their job done. 80% of police officers have stated in a recent survey that they have directly witnessed a fellow officer using more force than was necessary. Now I'm going to name some victims of police brutality that some of you may know of. So for the most recent example, one of the most popular examples is George Floyd, a 46-year-old black male who was killed in Minneapolis during an arrest allegedly using a counterfeit $20 bill. On March 13, Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old black EMT, was shot by police 8 times when entering her apartment while she was sleeping when they executed a no-knock search warrant on her in Louisville, Kentucky. On June 12, Rayshard Brooks was shot by an officer when a complaint filed against Brooks was asleep in the restaurant drive-thru line. On August 23, Jacob Blake was shot 7 times by police while trying to break up a fight between 2 women in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Now, these are just 5 out of countless other victims killed from police brutality and misconduct, racism. And there are still many cases that are popping up every day with the same scenario. And all these protesters that are out there every day only want justice for the victims that have lost their lives. There's a reason for all these protests and why many millions of people are enraged. There's a reason why. And all this evidence is showing us why there are people out there protesting, and this is a clear problem to our society. I can go on rambling about the corruption in the police department, but that's not the point of my presentation. The point of my presentation is to focus on how we can fix it. This leads to the question, how can the police department gain the citizens' trust again? And its consistency, fairness, and procedural justice. These are all elements of building foundations of trust and legitimacy between cops and people. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, for example, public participation, involving the broader community in the development of strategies for managing social order will encourage public acceptance. Neutrality, engaging in transparent, rule-based decision-making demonstrates that policing policy and practices are fair and unbiased. Respect, treating citizens with dignity communicates to them that their rights are being respected. Trustworthiness, showing sensitivity to people's needs and concerns, indicates that the police are sincerely trying to do what is best for those involved. So these 4, public participation, neutrality, respect, trustworthiness, these are all ways the police can build trust within the community. educating the police, elected officials, and the public about the community's racial and equity issue. Acknowledging the past harm they've made, acknowledging biases, and talking about and acting on issues of different kinds of diversity, racial issues, and so on. And most important, taking accountability on the part of law enforcement for bad decisions or actions. Now I want to switch this topic to real cops who stood up to corruption in their departments and what happened to them. Baltimore Police Department officer Joseph Crystal reported a police officer for beating a suspect while in custody, and he was arrested for being a rat and eventually forced out of the department. In 2010, Officer Laura Shook noticed her supervisors engaging in illegal activity. She went right to the chief of the police department with information. And according to Shook, the chief was unresponsive to the allegations. So she decided to go public. She told the media her supervisors were padding their overtime, essentially stealing money from the city. And what's this called? Rather than being celebrated within her department and the community for shining a light on corruption, Shook was fired from her job by the New Albany Police Merit Commission, and there was no reason given for her. There was no reason was given for the termination. The reason why I brought these stories up is because to show people that there are cops that are willing to fight, their own department, that are willing to shine a light on corruption. It's obvious to us that the police system needs to be reformed. There needs to be changes, and these cops are signs of progress. These are people that saw the issue and confronted the police departments. But what's terrifying is they got a negative response from these police departments. Usually many of them were fired. There are many stories of cops doing the right thing or shining a light to police misconduct, corruption. But the police department, we should be afraid of the police's responses to these type of people. Many of them were abused, harmed. These cops were fired for telling the truth, for following the values, for being fairness and, building their... Now I am going to talk about the progress in recent times. So the first thing I want to talk about is Derek Chauvin, the former American police officer who was convicted of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. So the murder trial began on March 8th, 2021, and concluded on April 20 when the jury found him guilty on all 3 charges. That is a sign of justice right there. Another sign of progression is 18 days after George Floyd was killed, the Minnesota state legislature introduced 48 bills in a special session on law enforcement. And on that same day, Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds signed a new bill restricting police chokeholds, and New York Governor Andrew Cuomo signed a series of police reforms into law, including repealing an obscure law, Section 50A, that shielded police disciplinary records from public scrutiny. So, of course, in politics, talking about doing something is one thing, and doing it is another. And by June 16th, 9 of these bills have become law, and 7 more are waiting for governor's signature. In all three state legislatures, Colorado, Iowa, and New York, have passed policing bills. Other signs of progression and justice. So in 2016, Daniel Holtzclaw, former Oklahoma City cop, was sentenced to 263 years in prison after being found guilty of 4 first-degree rape counts and many other charges. Michael Slager, a former cop from the Northern Charleston Police Department, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the death of Walter Scott in December 2017. Slager shot Scott, an unarmed black man, as he ran away from him on April 4th, 2015. Jose Tejada, he spent 17 years at the NYPD, and he was sentenced to 18 years in prison for running a crew of thieves that also robbed and assaulted drug dealers in 2015. In an address to a joint session of Congress, President Biden called on Senate Republicans to support the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which the House approved in March. The legislation would ban racial profiling, outlaw chokeholds, and no-knock warrants on the federal level, create a national police misconduct registry, and make changes to qualified immunity, which has shielded officers from being held personally responsible for constitutional violations. So for any parting thoughts, I just want to say that the purpose of my presentation is to let people know that we are all one. We are all in this community, and it's up to all of us to fix this. It's up to, we all have, whether you realize it or not, your actions affect the people around you, affect the community, and between cops and people, the strengthening ties between these two groups will heavily benefit our country, because it will build trust. It will build fairness. It will build a safer environment. And right now, it is heavily severed, creating lots of tension. And there's a reason for that, because it's clear to us that the police department is corrupt. There's injustice in the police department. It needs to be reformed. So how can the police gain our trust again, gain the citizens' trust again? And that's through consistency, fairness, and procedural justice. Because these are all elements of building foundations of trust and legitimacy. We are all one. We are all one community. All of us have to work together to fix this problem. There are even cops out there that see this, that shine a light on police misconduct and corruption. This shows us that we're against the people who are abusing this power. And that's my final thought. It's true that, there's so much evidence of injustice in the police department. There's a reason why there's so many people protesting. And, I argue that strengthening our bond between the cops and people will create lots of progress. And I believe that, us being separated won't do any good, because cops fight crime. And that's the purpose of having a cop system. But there's a lot of corruption in the cop system, and it needs to be reformed. And I'm repeating my words over and over again, but that's my final thought. All I'm saying is we are one community. It's up to all of us to fix these problems, because we live here. Cops are part of our community. We need them against all the evil, but also we got to address the evil in the cop system. And thank you for listening.